All right, we are live. Hello, 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 everyone. Tyler James here with another Comics Launch interview. My guest today is an experienced and trusted entertainment transactions attorney with an expertise in comic book publishing and IP licensing. He's worked as general counsel for the anime and manga company Central Park Media and was international publishing manager for Marvel Comics. You may have heard of them. Today, his practice creative contract consulting exists to help independent creators and publishers protect their rights and maximize their business models. And he is now the author of The Business of Independent Comic Book Publishing, which is a book that is now available live and funded and funding on Kickstarter and closing in on 500 backers. So I'm excited to get Gamal Hennessy back on the Comics Launch podcast, and congrats on the latest launch. How you doing?
Doing pretty good, sir. Thank you very much. We're excited about the launch. Things are going beyond my expectations.
Yeah, I know this is a project that you've been working on for a long time. We talked about this last year when you were on the Comics Launch podcast, and I think I promised to get you to come back on the show
Exactly.
when the book was out. And I know that this rollout hasn't exactly been what was originally planned. You were hoping, like many of us, to debut this at New York Comic Con. Is that correct?
That was the original plan as I was writing the book, but I was in the last 2 or 3 chapters in March when everything started to shut down. And I think the last big show was C2E2. And it became clear that I had to pivot, had to do something else different to kind of generate excitement. Because I'd been maintaining a Facebook group for the book for about 2 years just to build up kind of the momentum for it. And when I talked to my team, they said, well, if the group's already created and people are already excited for it, it might make sense to just pivot to a Kickstarter. And they turned out to be absolutely right, because we got funded within like 5 hours, I think. So
so the project is live on Kickstarter now. It's just the title of the project is the title of the book, The Business of Independent Comic Book Publishing. And I got 2 weeks to go as we're live streaming this tonight. So definitely check it out. And I'm excited to get my copy. But we're going to talk about this book. We're going to talk about a lot of the content and the work that has gone into the book, your experience. And I've got some questions. I've got some questions that came in from my community. I know we have some people that are going to be watching this live and on the replay. And I know you're very active on social and just make it a point to really be accessible for the community out there. So I also do want to open it up to questions pertaining to any of the concepts that you can speak to the audience as well as we go. But to kick things off, this is a really big topic, right? The business of independent comic book publishing. You didn't take on a small nut, and I know I've found with, like, whether it be a comic book series or a course that I've developed or books that I've written or even just like little trainings or even a podcast episode, it's doesn't really come to fruition until I sort of find the right structure for how to break it down. And what I like about what you've done with your book is you broke it down into the three distinct phases: pre-production, production, and post-production. Talk a little bit about the process of, okay, I've got these 15 plus years of experience and working on all these projects and all these things, but how did you go about sort of coming up with the structure for this and putting all the pieces together in a way that it is going to make sense to the average creator that's going to pick this up off the shelf?
Well, it's actually not as flattering a story as I would like it to be. The original concept was I was going to create a book that was going to encompass independent comic book publishing, freelance comic book publishing, creator-driven comic book publishing, and multimedia licensing.
Yeah.
And then when I started to talk to people that I knew in the industry, one of them, who happens to have one of the executives over at Valiant, said that is one of the most not smart ideas that you have ever had, because you're now talking about writing a book that may be more than 1,000 pages long, and it's going to take you like 10 years to write this thing, and no one's going to read it because it's going to be too long. What you should do is break it up into several phases. Do the independent publishing first as a foundation, then move into freelance publishing, then move into creator-driven publishing. And if you still have some energy after that, go into the licensing piece. And that turned out to be like some of the best advice that I got for the book, because just the independent publishing piece that's in this particular book, we're talking about 450 pages. We're talking about, 3.5 years of research, 4 dozen interviews. So the idea that I was going to do 4 or 5 times as much work for one book, yeah, I clearly wasn't thinking about what I was doing.
Yeah, you would have fallen into like the George R. R. Martin problem of having your printers tell you, yeah, no, we can't bind that. Sorry.
Exactly. I didn't even think like how are you going to bind a 1,000-page book? Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is not just for those of us out there that are writing nonfiction books or putting out resources for creators. Having a clear, concept in mind of who is the reader for, what's the transformation in the journey that they're going to go on, and speaking to specific challenges for specific people or a specific audience, is just it's a great practice to get in the habit of, especially if you don't, there are some people out there that can write on a broad topic and people will just buy the book because they're going like solely on, we already have this massive platform, and Stephen King can write a book on writing, right? He's he's been there. But for those of us that are trying to build up that audience and everything, solve it, like going narrow and going focused can actually be the thing that makes it really attractive to the right people who spread it to more of the right people. And it turns out, there's plenty of people in the world of independent comics that want to get better at their business. So I think you definitely chose wisely with that. So we've got some cool people in the house. Some love from Ben Napier, says Gamal's amazing, and I hope he doesn't miss the chance to back it. Yeah, go back it, Ben. It's available on Kickstarter for the next 14 days. Talk to me a little bit about the Kickstarter itself. Like, how did you? So this is, I see you've got some interesting sort of higher end tiers, as well as both a digital and a physical version. What was your thinking in terms of designing the Kickstarter and the offerings, and sort of keeping it streamlined and simple? It seems like that was a value for you.
Well, there was a lot of internal discussions about, should we provide like special artwork, or should we provide PDF forms, or should we provide a lot of things? And I came to the conclusion that the book is a very focused product, and I didn't want to get sidetracked or confused by other things that we might be offering. So it was a very simple structure. One, because we wanted people all over the world to be able to get the book, you offer the digital version, and because you can save some trees that way. Yep. You offer the physical version because I'm going to put it on my shelf, and other people are going to want to mark it up and do different things. That should go in there too. We added a higher tier. Well, after a lot of people from Canada asked us to add a Canadian tier, we put that in there just to cover the additional shipping charges there. And then we got into the consulting piece. And there are 2 stages there that we wanted to offer just to give a little bit more specific kind of foundation, because one of the things that I've run into, and I think the reason that I put this book together, is because it's actually speaking about business and legal concepts to a group of people who are by and large creatively focused. So they may actually want to know about all these concepts, but they don't have that background. That's not what they were taught. They were taught, line and form. They were taught story structure. They were taught, color shading. So I wanted to give 2 more levels of perks that I could sit down with them and walk through the entire process, from the time they have their initial idea through all of the major stages of the book, so that they can go into it with a little bit more confidence when they're actually trying to use the book for their own process. Because at the end, when you get to the end of the book, you should be able to have a business model that is specific for your circumstances, your comic, and where you want to go in your career. So those consulting levels, which are at $100 and $125, I don't know if there are any $125 slots left. There may not be. Will help you get to that point a little easier.
Yeah, yeah, and it seems like there's been a nice uptick on that. There's one $125 book and a consultation slot, and still some in the digital realm. So that's great. And these are, and I've know creators in the Comics Launch Pro community that have had consultations with you, have gone to you for one thing or another, and been very pleased with the time spent. So I'm glad that you'll be interacting with a lot of creators in the community and hopefully sharing some wisdom. What are some of the topics or things that that you think or that creators can bring to you in a consultation like that, and to really get get clarity around what they're trying to do?
Well, the way I'm planning on structuring it is I'm going to send basically a memo to them before the consulting. And I'm going to list out each of the major questions in the process of independent comic book publishing. There are basically 12 major questions that go from everything from why do you want to make comics in the first place, to who is going to be the reader for your comic, to how are you going to get the book into your reader's hands. And then we can walk through the process together so that I can actually give, if there's some things that they are not clear about, or they want some kind of different direction, or they just want a fresh take on how they can actually make their business model specific for their book. That's what we're going to actually talk through in the consultation.
Got it. Yeah. Some good feedback coming from the community. This is a book that needed to be made. Gamal is a great person to tackle the subject. Question that just came in. Does the book cover being a publisher to other creators?
Yes, because at the end of the book, there's a stage on growth. And once you actually get to the point where you have a business model, you have your distribution channels, you have everything in place, there's nothing stopping you from actually going out to other creators and folding their book into your publishing plan, as long as you understand the deal that you're going to make with them in terms of the business and legal side, and does their book actually fit into what it is you're planning to do long term. I mean, if you want to turn your publishing program into the next Image, there's nothing necessarily stopping you from doing that, as long as you have a business model that is sustainable and you have an attractive value proposition for the creators coming in, and it's not something that they can do themselves. Because I think, well, one of the things that may come out of this book is you get more and more creators who are comfortable handling the business themselves. I mean, long term, you may see a slight dip, 5 to 10% dip in the amount of people trying to get a creator-owned deal, because I think a lot of people go for a creator-owned deal because they say to themselves, well, I don't understand marketing, distribution, sales, revenue collection. But once they get the book, they might go, oh, I get it. And now maybe I don't want to give a percentage to a big publishing house, or maybe I want to put a book in a different way. And this will give them the confidence to actually try that step.
Yeah. On a related sort of question, I had a couple of questions come in the Comics Launch Pro community before that I put out because I said that you were coming in. And creator Gary Scott Beatty asked, like, what's the biggest mistake you see creators make when they are signing a publisher contract?
The biggest mistake I think that creators make is they have a fear of walking away. Because there are certain contracts that they might say, oh, this is a publishing contract. But what in actuality, the contract is a complete transfer of intellectual property rights. So you're losing all control and revenue from this potential book that's coming out. And creators, because they've spent so much time with this idea, and because they probably banged on a lot of doors to get someone to pay attention to their idea, when someone does actually bite, the last thing they want to do is walk away from what they feel might be the only offer they're going to get. It's one of the reasons that I wrote this book, because I want people to have what's known in the trade as the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So if someone gives you a deal and it's a bad deal, you know, if you've actually worked with this book, that it might be a better alternative for you to simply publish the book independently because you understand the whole process. So in your negotiations, you can say, okay, I don't necessarily want to give you all the movie rights and the merchandising rights forever, without any upfront money. And if that's the deal you're offering, then maybe I will just publish it independently. So I think not having the wherewithal or the confidence to walk away, or even to think, well, if this one publisher is interested, maybe another publisher will be interested and offer me a better deal.
Yeah, and I think it's a challenge for a lot of creators because the publishing deal they see may be the only deal they've ever seen presented to them, or it's the first one, and they're, you know, it's very hard to compare a deal to no frame of reference. But I think that's where having someone like yourself in their corner, you've seen plenty of deals. You've seen good ones. You've probably seen some pretty bad ones as well.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And what I try to do is when I do contract analysis for a client, I will break down every paragraph of the contract and explain to them how the words on the page actually impact their rights to their creation and their potential revenue stream. And if there's elements in the deal that I think will actually, basically they've given up everything, you let them know that. So, and there have been cases where clients have seen all of the negatives in the contract and still decided to sign the deal. Because some people, they want the exposure. Some people, they want the chance to see their book on the shelf in their comic shop next to, you know, all their favorite books. And maybe this is just their test deal. Maybe they know that they're going to be doing this long term, and maybe they feel like if they do one bad deal, the next deal will be better. There's a lot of different reasons why, and I don't begrudge anyone for that. I just tell them what is in front of them so they can make that decision with open eyes.
Yeah, definitely the case. We're talking to Gamal Hennessy about the new book, The Business of Independent Comic Book Publishing. Another question that comes up a lot from creators, especially creators that are working on their first book, and creators that are worried about keeping their, protecting their work. And I know that's a big part of what in the pre-production phase and a big part of the book that you talk about. But can you just, for those of us that are still concerned about this, like, copywriting your work as a comic book creator, what do creators need to know and actually do? Because you see a lot of creators, I know I hear a lot of creators that tell me, well, I haven't been able to go get an artist because my book isn't copywritten yet, and I don't want the artist to go and steal my book. And I personally don't think that's a valid reason to not get moving on your comic, on your stuff. But can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. The magic thing about a copyright, well, there's several magic things about a copyright. The first thing is, once you actually create a work in what's known as a fixed medium of expression, which means you type it down in your computer and you press save, you have technically created a copyright in that work. But there is another stage where you register the copyright with the Library of Congress to actually put the public on notice that you have created this work. And that is a process that you can do online. The Copyright Office has a website that allows you to file your copyright, from the comfort of your home. You can file the script for your comic before you have any artwork. And so you can achieve a copyright for your comic at the script stage. Knowing that your book is copywritten, then you can send it off to the artist with less concern that you're going to somehow lose the rights to your work, because the Copyright Office takes what's called the best and latest version of the book. So if 6 months, a year and a half from now, you actually have a finished comic, you can actually file another copyright, because now you have the script was the best version. Now the finished comic is the finished best version. You file that and you're protected. It is not an expensive process because it is about $65 per copyright. It is not a complex process because most of the time people come to me for copyrights and I just send them the link to the copyright page and say, you don't need to pay me to do this. You could do this. It's other aspects of your business that I will help you with. But they file a copyright and then they feel much better. The book actually goes into all the benefits that you get from filing a copyright, the way you file a copyright, how much it costs, the website links, everything.
Yeah, yeah. Jacob Newell says, love hearing about the business side of comics. Most people only talk about the process of making the book and are completely lost when it comes to protecting their IP or making sales. Yeah, it's one of the reasons Comics Launch exists, and it's one of the reasons I know this book exists is because you know I know you're a big attendee of comic book conventions in the New York area. You know a lot of creators in that avid community, and there's so much more that we could be doing with our work if we just sort of have the complete picture of how to turn it into a business. Another question that came up, and I know that something you've probably seen is that the world of independent comics is truly global and international. And it often involves creators working with an international team. So William Allen Goslin asked, how does one arrange contacts with foreign collaborators that can be recognized in both nations and potentially protect everyone?
Okay, the thing about a contract is one of the fundamental aspects of it is it's always going to be governed by the law of one particular country, and in the United States it's going to be one particular state. So if you as a independent creator are bringing in artists from around the world, you want them to be signing contracts that are governed by the laws of the state that you decide, not try to make it governed by the laws of multiple countries, because it doesn't actually work that way. And what you have in terms of recognition is usually not the issue for independent comic book publishing contracts. The issue is the relationship between compensation and deliverables, because you want to set up a situation where you are getting the work that you paid for, and the person that you're hiring is getting the compensation that they was promised. So you have to avoid the problem of asking for the creator to send you everything before you pay them, because most of them will never do that. And you have to also avoid the situation where you're paying in full before you actually get any of the material, because it is very difficult, especially when someone lives in another country, to go after them and enforce that contract, because even if there are legal mechanisms for you to do that, the cost of doing so is so high, especially for an independent creator with limited investment to put into their book. You're not going to necessarily be able to sue some artist in the Philippines who didn't actually produce their pages, because A, you may not be able to sue them, B, they may not have any money to sue, and C, it may cost so much to sue that none of it's going to actually be worth it. So you have to control that process in the contract. And what I always suggest is something that I refer to as the tennis method, where you set up a deal with someone and say, okay, once the deal is signed, I will give you a quarter of the money that we actually agreed to. And then you're going to do a quarter of the work. And then I'll send you another quarter of the money. And then you'll send me another quarter of the work. And it goes back and forth until both sides have the 100% of what it is that they wanted to get. And there's always an incentive on both sides to keep the process going, because the artist wants to get their money, you want to get your finished product. So you use that method to kind of reduce the risk and keep everybody on track.
Yeah, I think that's a great strategy for structuring your payment. I do know of creators that have just gone and paid everything up front, and then they find themselves in this position where they feel like they're a nag and they're the bad person when they're asking, "Hey, where are my pages?" I've often joked that if there was ever a detective agency or private investigations agency whose only job was to find missing collaborators that have gone dark on the internet, that person would never be out of work, because that's such a common thing.
Exactly. Exactly. But the good thing about comics is because it is a staged industrial process, there's actually multiple logical stages where you could actually build in the compensation. For if you're working with an artist, you could have one payment for, character design, one payment for thumbnails, payment for rough pencils, one payment for finished pencils, and on down the line. And it's not weird because, that is the process. It's not as if you're asking for someone to just give you finished pages out of thin air. So you can build that into your structure.
Yeah, yeah. It turns out William's watching live, and he had a follow-up. He said, "What about creative partnerships or royalties? Should I just choose my state and just abide by my local regulations and hope my partner takes my word for it?"
Okay, well,
Thoughts on
now
that?
it sounds like you're talking about a different type of deal where it's a collaboration agreement as
Mm.
opposed to a work for hire. There are some work for hire agreements that include royalties, but most of them don't. Most of them are just upfront payments. But if you have a collaboration agreement, then the fundamental business structure is different. And it's not going to be necessarily the state's contract law that's going to govern, although that can in many ways impact it. But contract law is fairly uniform, especially when it comes to these kind of agreements. What you want to make sure is you have laid out all the royalties for every different type of media if you're talking about a collaboration agreement, because in that case both sides are actually, or however many sides are involved, they're sharing ownership of the underlying intellectual property. So that means it's not, to take a wild example, it's not Jim Lee going to do an episode of an issue of Batman and then walking away. It's somebody's offering Jim Lee 10% of Batman, the whole thing. So now the whole deal becomes not so much about the comic itself, although the terms of the comic are still important. It becomes what happens to anything that might occur with this intellectual property, and walking through that process and those royalty percentages in every single stage. So, for example, if you have a writer and an artist working on a book and they're doing a collaboration agreement, one of the things that they have to figure out is if it's going to be just a novelization where it becomes purely prose, does the writer get more because the artist's work is not actually involved in that expression of the intellectual property? And is it reversed if it becomes like merchandise, where it's the artist's rendering of the design of the character that is more used than the actual writer's like script? So at each stage, you can adjust who gets what depending on how the property might be manipulated. Or you could do what a lot of people do and just split it 50-50 across the board, whether it's a Netflix deal, whether it's an interactive, it's a video game or anything else.
Yeah, yeah. And, I think while it's true that every local locality has different regulations and different terms and everything, like most of the deals, most of the things that most comic creators are going to put together, cover a few things that really shouldn't be too jurisdictionally.
They're not. They're most of the time they are not. It is not, the choice of law and choice of venue provisions are not necessarily going to impact the business terms of the deal. It is more an impact if, in the worst case scenario, it goes to like litigation. Where's the case going to be? Which court is the case going to be in? And things like that. But since the vast majority of cases of comic book contracts, even if they fall apart, don't lead to litigation, it's something that you should be aware of, but you should not necessarily lose a lot of sleep over.
Mm-hmm. Now, are there breakdowns or sort of elements of things that should be in contracts? Is that something that's covered or included in the book?
Oh, absolutely. We have a chapter on the fundamental concept of contracts itself. And then we have a one chapter that's specifically about the collaboration agreement and breaking down the elements of a collaboration agreement. And there's one chapter on the breakdown for the work for hire agreement. There's also a chapter specifically on how compensation works in the comic book industry, because it is a unique type of model for compensating talent that's not necessarily prevalent in other industries. So we try to cover all the bases there.
Yeah, great. I think that's going to fill in a lot of gaps for creators out there. So I know one of the things that is also covered in your book, obviously there's everything that goes up to creating the book and pre-production and getting it together and getting your contracts in place and getting the team going. But then you've created this thing, and now it's time to market it. A question came in from a small press publisher and writer, Joe D. McPhee. He asked, do you have any strategies or tips to keep the audience engaged and make them rabid for your work or your next communication or your next thing? I know one of the things that you said that really helped with your book was that Facebook group, right?
There's actually one of I think the largest segment in the book is the segment on marketing, because I think that is one of the fundamental challenges that the comic book industry, not just independent comics, but comics as a whole, actually falls short, is in the marketing aspect of a book. So, and the company that I work for now, Global Comics, one of the things that we try to do in addition to distribution is we actually have whole webinars on marketing for independent publishers to help them actually understand how to build a market, how to identify their ideal reader, how to analyze their competition, and how to utilize all that information to build a market. But the short answer is you have to actually decide or figure out, based on the elements in your book, who is the target market, who is going to want to read this book more than anyone else. And once you identify that group of people, engage with them in a continual conversation that is not necessarily about your book, but about the things that they actually like to talk about. So if one of the examples that I give in the book is, if I create a vampire organized crime comic, well, then I go into one of the things that I do, and this is before the book is even created, is I find groups online who have already organically formed, and I start to interact with them, especially when they're interested in vampires or organized crime, or both, because there's quite a few vampire, organized crime, Facebook, Twitter groups out there. You start to build those communities, and they may not have any exposure to comics, but you're actually building the relationship with them because they're interested in the type of things you're talking about. It's the story, not the actual medium of the story, that you can use to actually build up those relationships. And if you do that over time, and when I say time, I mean months or even a year or two, by the time the book comes out, you'll have that rabid audience. If you want to see an example of that, just look at the marketing campaign for Avengers Endgame. If there was ever any one piece of content that did not need to have advertising, it was the sequel to one of the top grossing movies of the year that also happened to be the climactic chapter of one of the most successful runs of movies of all time. They didn't need a commercial to get people in the door, but they still had 4 or 5 commercials. There was still the interviews of all the main characters. There was still the marketing tie-ins, and they did it over a period of 2 years to get that movie out. So if that movie needed that marketing plan, an independent publisher's comic needs that marketing plan.
Yeah, and that's why it always cracks me up when creators are like, "Oh, should I send another tweet? Am I marketing my Kickstarter too much?" If Avengers Endgame still has to spend, $250 million to hit their targets and be everywhere, like one thing they're not worried about is being, sending too many tweets, right? Or having too much awareness, right?
Exactly. You want to, especially as an independent publisher, gauge it in a way that you're not basically hammering people every 15 minutes to buy your book. But if you're constantly engaging them with something that interests them, then you're not bothering them because you're talking to them about things they want to talk about. Every once in a while, and it's usually like 10-15% of all of your marketing messages, then you slip in something about your book, then it becomes a natural part of the conversation. It's not you just, hammering down on people, another tweet, another tweet, another tweet, buy my book. It's, hey, have you guys seen this? Hey, this artwork is really cool. Hey, I've done a review of this book because I liked X, Y, or Z. Now you're engaging people as opposed to marketing at them.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's great. And, the more different approaches to putting together, not just like a couple of tweets or, hey, I post on Instagram, like that's not a marketing plan, right? Posting on Instagram, that's not a marketing plan. Having a holistic thing and seeing how all the pieces fit together, I think is absolutely key. And I think you're right that those markets out there, especially not just the comic book first markets, can be actually very lucrative. Another question that came in related to contracts. This creator's asking, what was the worst contract you saw a creator given, and did you manage to renegotiate it for them or talk them out of it? Any tales from, I'm sure obviously we can't divulge details, but
Exactly.
any tales?
Deals. Yeah, there have been deals where it is clear from the outset that this person has been working on this comic for a very long time, and they got a contract in from somewhere. And the more you read it, the more you realize not only is the publisher attempting to acquire the book in question. So let's say I write Best Comic A. They have actually put in the contract that they have complete ownership of Best Comic A and anything else that this creator might create in the future, and that this creator is actually signing on to do work for other books that they don't know anything about for an undisclosed period of time. And the pay structure is such that it does not exist because it is using a form of Hollywood accounting that makes sure that the creator will never actually get any compensation for what they've done. So you have to explain to them that this deal, you have basically signed on to give away everything you've created and work for free. Congratulations, you got an offer, quote unquote. And in those cases, it is much easier to talk someone off the ledge to say, okay, there is no upside to this deal, because it's the kind of deal where you're not even getting credit on the book that you created and sent to this publisher. So that is probably, but the thing is, I've only seen that contract like once or twice, and that was like 5 or 6 years ago. So hopefully I won't see that type of thing again. But it's the kind of thing that as you're reading it for your client, you're actually getting angry on their behalf.
Yeah, those are the good ones. Those are the good ones too. When you're just like red penning it and
exactly. And at some point you have to just stop. Okay, there's a certain point in the contract where you realize that some contracts are not negotiable, in that there's so much that needs to be changed that you might as well throw the whole thing out and do a new deal or walk away. So that's one of those types of contracts.
Yeah, definitely. Hopefully those would be obvious enough, but if not, if it smells a little fishy to you, then you take it to someone like Gamal, and he'll definitely show you that it stinks. So I know, and there's so much in this book that you're covering. It is a beast, as we said. But one of the things that I think that you do touch on is sort of using your comics or your comics IP to generate multiple streams of revenue. Mm-hmm. And it strikes me that now more than ever, with some creators in our community who the bulk of their income came from conventions, are suddenly forced to find some new streams of revenue. I'm curious, what are some of the things that you're seeing that sort of savvy creators are doing with their properties, and maybe some things to think about beyond just, hey, I'm making a comic and selling it for $4?
Well, there are new models actually emerging all the time. You have your traditional, like what's called indirect methods, where you might be doing advertising on your page and then driving the traffic with the comic content. And once people land on the page, then yes, they see the advertising and you get paid on a CPM basis for the ads. You can try affiliate marketing. There's a chapter in the book on corporate sponsorships or corporate relationships. There's obviously crowdfunding has been a huge thing in comics for the past 8, 9 years. There's direct you can have there's now direct sales that you can try to if you want to sell print, you can ship directly to your customers without necessarily going through like a diamond or going to a convention if you have that set up, that digital store set up on your website. There are and I do believe eventually the convention distribution model is going to come back. But I actually advise creators, again, to look beyond the convention market to other clusters of potential people you can sell your comic to based on what your comic is about. So if you, let's say, when we can all go back to group settings, let's say you have like a very military heavy, very tech spec, very like highly technical book about, firearms and things like that. There's nothing stopping you from getting a table at a gun show and then selling the book at the gun show, because the people who like guns like to read things about guns. And guess what? You will probably be the only person selling comics there until everyone who does military type comic books starts to go to the gun shows. But we're not at that point yet. This point, you'll be the only one. There's no competition there from anyone else. If you have a horror comic, you could go to a horror convention. There have been music festivals here in New York where the music might be it might be hip hop, it might be something else, and certain comic book publishers will show up. Like I know when I went, there's a festival called Afropunk. It's been running every year, but when you go to Afropunk the past 2 or 3 years, Marvel has a booth there, and they just happen to only be selling Ironheart, Black Panther, Storm, Falcon, and that's pretty much it, because they know that there's a heavy concentration of African Americans in that festival. So they just take all the African American books and put them on the shelf. Those books were moving. There was a line at that booth. So it's the same kind of thing. Your book has two different ways to draw in people. One is because it's a comic, you can reach comic book fans. But two, whatever story you're telling, those groups of people actually exist. Talk to those groups of people, and you're not going to get the whole group. You may only get 1% or 5%. But if you got, let's say you have a adult fantasy kind of book, if you can get 1% of the Game of Thrones fans, you've got a successful comic, a wildly successful comic.
Oh yeah.
Even though George R.R. Martin won't put out the last book. I mean, you'll still get those people. It's the same thing with every other genre and multiple genre that you can put together.
Yeah, I think that's some great insight, and there is a lot that you can do with it. So get right on to creating the darn thing is a lot that goes into it. Again, the project is The Business of Independent Comic Book Publishing. It's available on Kickstarter. It'll be there for the next 14 days. I did get a backer that someone that already backed you. They're excited to see you launch on Kickstarter, but he's giving you a little tip. He wants to see a digital and physical tier so that he can get the PDF download and read it on his Kindle. Is that something that could be made available?
I think that's where we've been deciding. We're going to decide to go because we've had multiple requests for that tier. So it was something we actually talked about in the beginning, and we said, well, once we get through it, if we get, and I think the discussion was, if we get close to being funded, then maybe we'll add in that tier to kind of push us over the hump. Like, well, we actually passed that a while ago, but I think we're still going to add in that tier because there's a significant amount of interest in it.
Well, here would be my suggestion: is you come up with, maybe some, like, if you could get some of the a couple of those interviews or a little bit of extra bonus audio or video training, package that plus the physical plus the digital, create a new tier in that sort of, let's see, 12 and 30, put it in maybe the 45 or 49 or $50 range, right in the middle. There you go.
Yeah, you have some insight, my friend. I appreciate that.
I've done this a couple of times.
Yeah. It shows.
Well, this is great. I wanted to just make sure that creators know, beyond getting this book, which I'm sure most of them are going to do, and then those that have an immediate or pressing concern or consultation that they want to talk, they can grab one of those limited edition awards for the consultations. But what are just some of the key things that creators are coming to you for that you can do for them with your practice right now for creative contract consulting, just so that they know that, hey, I don't have to figure this stuff out on my own. I can spend a little bit of time with Gamal and he can get me all straightened out.
Well, what usually creators more and more now, and it's actually very heartening to see, is that they're coming to me much more early in their process of putting their book together. So instead of what used to happen 2-3 years ago, someone would come to me and say, well, a friend and I, we made a book and now we're about to publish it, but we never had a contract and now we want to make a contract. I mean, it's not the best case scenario, but we worked around it. Now people are coming to me much earlier saying, okay, I have an idea. I got a copyright. Now I want to get the contracts before I even go solicit talent. So I know that I can just hand them a contract to say, okay, this is what the deal is going to be. And so a lot of work for hire contracts, a lot of collaboration agreements. There's still a lot of contract review. People are, they're getting interest from publishers. They're bringing me the contract to actually review for them. A lot of corporate formation, because they're looking at this as a long-term sort of business, and they want to put together a business organization that can actually hold the intellectual property, get the tax benefits, get the liability benefits. So there's a lot of different things in the pre-production phase. A lot of trademark review. People are actually trying to make sure that they can spin off their book into multiple forms of merchandise up front, because that's their long-term goal. So a lot of that is actually coming in concurrently with the development of the book.
Great. Yeah, and I'm sharing a link. I'll share a link in the podcast and on the stream for those of you who want to check out creativecontractconsulting.com and the list of all the services and things that you offer there. But yeah, I think it's a good trend for creators just tackling this stuff early and be thinking long term, because these creations are our babies and we want to take good care of them and keep them protected. Well, hey, thank you so much for your time tonight, Gamal. I'm really excited for how the campaign is doing. Definitely make sure that everyone is able to check it out and grab a copy before it's out. And who knows, there may even be a couple new rewards up there for you before this thing is out. But it's great to check in with you again. And I'm glad to hear that you're doing the best you can over in COVID season. I think we're all hanging in there. But any final words or just a piece of advice or wisdom, either from the book or just from your experience, that you want to leave the Comics Launch listeners with?
Well, I think specifically for the Comic Launch listeners, I want them to really lean into the idea that crowdfunding is a viable and growing source of revenue that they should look at, not just as a way to pay for printing, but over the long term to use it at almost like a pre-order system. Because if you maintain your communities, and that's the main thing, not just to kind of get people excited when the book is coming out or when you're actually running a campaign, but to make sure you have your community and you build that up over time, so that when it's time for you to come out with a book, whether it's crowdfunded or not, people are already excited about it because they know they like you and they like the work that you do, and they've seen it So you're not just something that comes out of nowhere for them. You're a known quantity that they, at a certain point, just buy sight unseen because they know what kind of work you put out.
Yeah, and this is something that I've been sort of really just hammering in lately is when you establish yourself on a platform like Kickstarter and are able to launch and then launch again and build equity. That's that Kickstarter account that you create is like one of your most powerful business assets. There's a creator in Comics Launch Pro just launched today, Newton Lillebois. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work. Crescent City Monsters. It's a new project that's up there. He's been working on this. I think this has been serialized on Kickstarter. Absolutely gorgeous artwork, but it's the kind of thing where he's been I think it's either his third or fourth. Yeah, it's his fourth launch. And he's just been building, and he's going after his biggest goal yet in the 10K category. And as soon as he launched, it just ripples through the Kickstarter ecosystem, and then another kick, and all his backers from previous campaigns that are following him get notified, and it just becomes this thing where that first campaign he launched, it took him a month to raise close to $7,000. Now he's done it in hours, and it's really, really cool to see how that can happen for a creator working on his first book and really just doing the work. But this really does become an asset for you, and it's not what people thought Kickstarter was going to be, where it's like this one-time card that you can play and cash in all your chips, and then okay, you got crowdfunded, you're done.
Yeah, it's a business model. And as long as you can actually leverage the business model and maintain, well, I think once you understand revenue streams and actually your cash flow, because the thing about something like crowdfunding is you have to be able to maintain the business. You have to be able to develop the product, knowing that there's not necessarily a stream of cash coming until the very end. So if you can manage your money that way, manage your finances that way, then it makes perfect sense to use that as your major source of revenue, in the same way that some people used conventions as their major source of revenue, knowing that they couldn't actually, if they didn't show up at the table, they weren't going to get their money.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I could talk, I could talk comics and business all day, Gamal, but I'm going to let you get back to promoting the Kickstarter and doing all you do. But really do appreciate the time that you spent with us. And I want to thank everyone else out there watching this in the Comics Launch audience. And, we can't wait to see what you all launch next. And Gamal will be there to help you protect it and maximize it. So thank you so much, sir.
All right. Thank you, sir.
All right. Have a great one. Bye-bye now.